For more than 200 years, practically all of even the most free market advocates have assumed that money and banking were different from other types of goods and markets. From Adam Smith to Milton Friedman, the presumption has been competitive markets and free consumer choice are far better than government planning and regulation, except in the realm of money and financial intermediation. This belief of the need for government to control money and banking, this belief has been taken to the extreme over the last 100 years. At least before the First World War, before 1914, the general consensus among economists, many political leaders, and the vast majority of the citizenry is that governments could not be completely trusted with management of the monetary system. Abuse of the monetary printing press would always be too tempting for demagogues, special interest groups, and short-sighted politicians looking for easy ways to fund their way to power, privilege, and political advantage. Thus, before 1914, the national currencies of virtually all the major countries of what used to be called the civilized world were anchored to market-based commodities, either gold or silver. This was meant to place money outside the immediate and easily arbitrary manipulation of governments. Any increase in gold or silver money required private individuals to find it profitable to prospect for it in various parts of the world, mine it out of the ground and transport it where it might be refined into usable forms, and then mint part of the new supplies into coins and bullion, with the rest made into various commercial and industrial products demanded on the market. The paper currencies controlled by governments and their central banks were supposed to be issued only as claims, as money substitutes for quantities of the real gold and silver money, deposited by members of the society in banks for safekeeping and for the convenience of everyday business in the marketplace. Government central banks were meant to see that the society's medium of exchange was properly assayed and minted, and to monitor and police private banks and itself to make sure that the rules of the gold or silver standard were properly followed. Banknotes were to be issued or deposit accounts increased in the banking system as a whole only when there had been net additions to the quantity of commodity money within the economy. Any withdrawals of the commodity money, gold and silver, from the banking system was to be matched by a decrease in the total quantity of banknotes in circulation and deposit accounts payable in that money. Did governments always play by the rules of this bank and gold game? Unfortunately, the answer is no. But by and large, in the half century or so before the First World War, governments and their central banks managed their national currencies with surprising constraints. If we look for a reason for this, that is why they restrained their abuse of money in these national banking systems under gold. If we look for a reason for this, a leading one was that for a good part of this earlier era, the predominant set of ideas was that of political and economic liberalism. But we need to remember that at that time, liberalism meant an advocacy and defense of individual liberty, secure private property rights, free markets, free trade, and limited government under constitutional order with impartial rule of law. But nevertheless, these national currencies were still government-managed paper monies, linked to gold or silver by history and tradition, and more or less left fairly free of direct and abusive government manipulation, due to the prevailing political philosophy of the time that considered governments as protector of individuals to their rights to life, liberty, and their honestly acquired property. However, in the decades leading up to the First World War, the political trends began to change. New ideals and ideologies started to appear and gain increasing hold over people's minds. The core conception was a growing belief in the necessity for and the good that could come from political paternalism. Governments were not to simply be impartial umpires who enforced the rule of law and protected people and their property from violence and fraud. No. Government was to intervene into the social and economic affairs of men, to regulate markets, redistribute wealth, and pursue visions of national greatness and collective welfare. This meant a change in the political philosophy behind the government's control of the monetary system as well. In the decades after the First World War, in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the government monetary managers increasingly became monetary central planners. The central banks were to manipulate the supply of money and credit in the economy to To do what? Well, stabilize the price level, maintain full employment, peg or change foreign exchange rates, lower or raise interest rates to influence the amount and the types of investments undertaken by private borrowers and investors in the economy, and whenever and however necessary, increase the quantity of money in the economy to fund government deficits needed by politicians and interest groups to feed their insatiable appetite for power, privilege, and political plunder. The triumph of Keynesian economics in the post-World War II period resulted in a near monopoly of academic and public policy advocates who argued that private enterprise was unstable and unfair and could only be allowed to exist and function in a wider environment of dominating government control. A government constantly increasing in size, scope, and pervasive supervision and intrusion into every corner of personal, social, and economic life. But big governments cost big sums of money. About 100 years ago in America, in 1913, all levels of government combined, federal, state, and local, absorbed only around 7% of the nation's income and output. Today, all levels of government seize nearly 50% of all that is earned and produced in the United States, and even more than this if we add the financial burdens imposed upon private enterprise to comply with the strangling spider's web of regulations and controls imposed on businessmen going about their business. Just in the last 2.5 years under the Obama administration, the federal government has accumulated nearly $3 trillion in additional debt. About the same time, during the last 3 years, the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, has created at least $2 trillion of new money. In other words, the Federal Reserve has in fact already produced, out of thin air, a sum of money equal to 2 out of every $3 the federal government has borrowed during this period. Now, the economics textbooks usually sanitize this type of process with a sterile terminology that calls it monetizing the debt. An earlier generation of economists and critics of political paternalism used to call this process paper money inflation and debauchery of the currency, the diluting of the value of the money in people's pockets through monetary depreciation and currency devaluation. America and the other major Western countries of the world have become, in the words of Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan, perpetual democracies in deficit, funded in total or in part by now trillions of dollars created by government monetary monopolies, the central banks. Today, we are reaping the whirlwind of decades of political paternalism and monetary central planning. Nations like Greece are at the edge of financial bankruptcy and debt default. And countries like the United States, woven so tightly with networks of special interest groups living off the redistributive plunder of other more productive members of the society, that the country lurches from fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis, apparently on a monthly basis now if you watch the news, that seems to offer little ways to stop the worsening avalanche of massive annual deficits and mounting national debt. The demagogues and the political tricksters harangue about soaking the rich to fund the unfunded entitlements of Social Security and Medicare for the rest of the 21st century. They demand that big business pay for the government jobs to nowhere that is promised to end the unemployment that earlier and current misguided economic policies have created and continue to prolong. And they, of course, have also taken recourse to that last refuge of every political scoundrel, the call to patriotism. It is your duty as a good citizen to pay your fair share, to cooperatively be subservient and obedient to the demands and needs of government, to sacrifice your freedom and the fruits of your own hard-earned honest labor for the national interest and the common good. It is worth remembering that those in the political arena who claim to know the national interest and the common good are the same ones who also assert the right to compel you to conform to their vision of a just and fair America. regardless of how much you may honestly disagree or desire to peacefully go your own way. A central tool for governments to maintain their authority in society and their control over people's lives is their ability to make the citizenry accept and use their monopoly medium of exchange. This is a linchpin in the government's ability to transfer the people's wealth and privately produce output to satisfy the needs of its own spending. It makes each and every citizen an existing and potential victim of government abuse of the monetary printing press, since paper currencies are no longer in any way linked to or limited by a market-based supply of a real commodity such as gold or silver. We should not presume that runaway hyperinflations and the accompanying destruction of society's medium of exchange only occurs in places like 1920s Germany or contemporary African countries like Zimbabwe, that it can't happen here. It can happen here. The fact is, the welfare state is bankrupt. It is bankrupt on the one hand ideologically. The reality is no one really believes that the interventionist redistributive state will bring mankind material happiness and social harmony. Everybody knows that it is nothing more than a vast and corrupt political machine through which, as Frederick Bastiat said long ago, everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. In the process, the productive capacity of the society slowly grinds to a halt, as more and more people turn from productive self-responsibility to redistributive dependency. It also generates a mentality and a political presumption of legitimacy to that redistributive dependency that pervades each and every income group and social category throughout the nation. Most political opinion polls say that a fairly sizable majority of the American people think that government is too big, that it spends too much, and that it taxes too excessively. But once the questions turn to specifics of cutting particular government programs, it is soon seen how the tentacles of the welfare state reach into everyone's, or virtually everyone's, pocket. It is not only that the government taxes people in varying amounts to feed the redistributive process, but there are a few people in the land who do not have some type of money, program, or benefit put into their pockets by government. Most people cannot imagine living without their government redistributive fix. And admittedly, breaking a people's addiction to their government benefits, subsidies, protections, and special favors would and will involve serious and painful withdrawals. This also means that the welfare state is rapidly reaching financial bankruptcy as well. Neither taxation nor borrowing of private savings can or will be enough to cover all the costs of current and future government spending under existing interventionist and redistributive legislation and regulations. The government may very well, therefore, trying to be impartial here, the government may very well, therefore, use its most important financial resource to keep the wheels of political spending going. Of course it will. Turning the handle of the monetary printing press more and more and faster and faster. Time after time, history has demonstrated that when serious price inflations turn into disastrous hyperinflations, people first discount and then abandon the government's money monopoly. They shift into alternative currencies of choice that they consider more stable, more predictable, and more wealth and income preserving than the increasingly worthless pieces of paper money that their own government spews out in increasing quantities. Now, such a monetary disaster is not preordained. It is not written in some big book in the sky. Governments and societies have in the past pulled back and stopped short of following a path leading to social and economic ruin. America, too, may yet slow down or bring to a halt the political course that it is currently traveling. The future is unpredictable, and trends have changed many times in the past. But forewarned is forearmed. So how shall any of us be able to try to shelter ourselves from the possible coming fiscal and monetary storm. Central to such precautionary actions is to hedge against the possible radical depreciation and even destruction of the government's currency. To the extent that one sees such a danger and has the financial wherewithal to plan ahead, individuals should be legally allowed to opt out of the government's monopoly money. Amen. In other words, every American should be free from the government's power to compel its citizens to use and accept in trade and in settlement of debts its own depreciating currency. Everyone and anyone should be free to choose the currency or commodity to hold and use as a medium of exchange without restriction, penalty, or political prejudice. This is what makes the Utah Legal Tender Act of March 2011 so profoundly important. By making the use of gold and silver coins issued by the United States government as lawful money in market transactions and the settling of debt, the state of Utah has begun a process that logically should result with the establishment of monetary freedom for the people of the United States. But why should only gold and silver coins issued by the U.S. government be considered as lawful money? Why not currencies and gold and silver coins issued by other governments that Americans may choose to hold and use? And why not currencies and gold and silver coins issued by private banks and financial institutions that individuals choose to accept, hold, and use? Monetary freedom would not only give every citizen a right to protect and secure his income, wealth, and market transactions from abusive mismanagement of the government's monetary and monopoly printing press, it would also serve as a check on the degree of such government abuse. As was said in the introductory remarks, the very notion of choice in currency was an idea that was floated by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek in a lecture that he gave in Switzerland in 1975, the year after he won the Nobel Prize. And this is partly what he said in this 1975 lecture on choice in currency. There would be no more effective check against the abuse of money by government than if people were free to refuse any money they distrusted and to prefer money in which they had confidence. Nor would there be a stronger inducement to governments to ensure the stability of their money than the knowledge that so long as they kept the supply below the demand, that demand would tend to grow. Therefore, let us deprive governments or their monetary authorities of all power to protect their money against competition. If they can no longer conceal that their money is becoming bad, they will have to restrict its issue or see its destruction. Making it merely legal, and people will very quickly indeed choose to refuse to use the national currency once it depreciates noticeably, and they will make their dealings in a currency they trust. Unquote. Taking away from government its power of compelling the citizenry to accept money that it monopolistically controls and abuses may serve as an important legal and economic change to force the government and those who live at its spending trough to face the reality of the welfare state's ideological and fiscal bankruptcy before it is too late to avert a complete collapse of the society. Choice in currency may be a valuable avenue for helping to restore the American tradition and practice of individual rights, free markets, and limited government under the rule of law. And what greater legacy could we leave to our children and grandchildren who will be living through the rest of the 21st century? Thank you very much.